my computer over here. I'll mute myself then. Okay.
Right on. Thank you.
So there's usually a 15, 30-second delay. So. Okay. All right. You're live.
All right. Well, happy Thursday to everyone, and welcome to our ABCs of Sports Nutrition, brought to you by Jackrabbit. And today we are talking about carbohydrates, which we all know and love for various reasons. I am Roxanne Vogel, the Nutrition and Performance Research Manager at GU Energy Labs. I am also a PhD researcher, and I am interested in exercise physiology and sports nutrition. And we have a wonderful roundup of panelists with me today, and I'm very excited to introduce you to. So first up, in no particular order, we have the professor, that is Greg Grosicki. And Greg is a assistant professor and director of exercise physiology exercise physiology laboratory at Georgia Southern University. He has a PhD in human bioenergetics from Ball State University and a postdoc from Tufts University in gut muscle axis and implications for aging muscle. So he's also an athlete, and Greg likes to compete in triathlons. He also ran cross country in college, is a Cat 2 road cyclist, and is an elite amateur triathlete for the Everyman Jack triathlete team. He also was a finisher at 2018 Ironman World Championships in Kona. All right, and next up, we have Sonia Looney. She is a world champion professional cyclist, including a 2015 24-hour solo mountain bike world champion. And she has her master's degree in electrical engineering. She also earned a certificate in plant-based nutrition from Cornell University and is working on a health coaching program at Vanderbilt University. She also hosts her own top 100 ranked podcast about high performance living, and she's an entrepreneur. The newest addition to her life is her most important role. She is a new mom. Sonia is known for her positivity, mental toughness, and top performances at some of the longest and hardest mountain bike races in the world. For Sonia, it's about sharing her personal stories combined with her research in the fields of psychology, mindfulness, plant-based nutrition, in order to help people live better every day. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeff Browning, also known as Bronco Billy, who is a veteran ultra runner and ultra endurance coach. He has competed in some of the world's hardest and most competitive ultra mountain races over the past 2 decades. He's finished over 130 ultra marathons in his career, racking up over 30 career wins. Some highlights include 21 wins and 39 finishes in the 100-mile running category. He has the 3rd most 100-mile wins in ultra running history. And he was ranked 3rd in Ultra Running Magazine's North American Ultra Runner of the Decade. He also holds multiple course records, including the very challenging double record for the fastest combined times of the Western States 100 and Hard Rock 100 ultra marathons. These are only 19 days apart. So thank you to all of our guests. I am so excited to have you here, and just a bunch of rock stars to help me talk about carbohydrates. So first of all, I want to start with a question for each of you. What is your favorite GU product? I'll start with Sonia.
It depends on the day, but right now I'm really enjoying the Roctane drink mix, particularly the lemon berry, because it's been really, really hot where I live. It's been about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And with the time that I have with childcare, I'm training in the middle of the day. So I need the extra electrolytes, and also I need the extra calories because I'm a breastfeeding mom.
Awesome. Yes. Roctane. Delicious. Jeff, how about you?
GU Roctane powder, the grape. That's my go-to for pretty much everything. And then gels and chews, but Roctane grape's the base.
All right, the non-caffeinated flavor. I gotcha. And Greg, what about you?
So like Sonia, I'm also a new parent. I have a 1-year-old daughter, and I'm not training in the middle of the day, but training at 4 a.m. So my favorite new GU product is the cold brew coffee GU, which packs a 70 milligram of caffeine punch per each GU, and it's perfect when you wake up and don't have time to brew a cup of. There you go, right there.
It's my favorite too.
Exactly. Yeah, I love it.
I barely remember those days. My kids are a lot older now, so.
Man, am I the only one without kids?
I vaguely remember sleep deprivation, all that.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got a nice list of topics we wanted to cover today, but this show was really meant for kind of the newbie, beginner athlete, someone who's just starting to get into their sport of choice, maybe doesn't know what they should be doing when it comes to fueling. And so, we wanted to keep this pretty basic and just cover all of the essentials that someone would need to know if they were just getting into sports nutrition. And so, first of all, I wanted to share a little slide that I usually share with athletes when I'm first beginning to work with them. So let me pull that up. And so this is what I like to refer to as the endurance athlete's nutrition pyramid. And so it's important to remember that, no matter what you're doing or how much your training you're doing, it's really important to start with a solid foundation. And that is your daily nutrition, because you might be training for anywhere from less than an hour up to, 6 hours more a day. But most of the rest of the time of the day, which is a majority of your day, you're doing all of the other normal things. So that includes all of the foods you eat in your normal daily diet. And so that's why it's the most important thing you can do to ensure good performance is to have a solid diet based on balance, moderation, and lots of variety. So lots of color, lots of plant-based foods, vegetables, fruits, etc. And then if you, start to increase your intensity, maybe you're going for a hike or a walk or something pretty low key, you might start to consider snacks you can take with you, and that could include solids and bars. And this is going to be stuff that you can digest because you're working at a pretty low to moderate intensity. You're not running or sprinting or anything like that. And so your digestive system is still pretty much on track. And then you go up in intensity again to the top of the pyramid there. And so this would be where you're running, cycling really hard, or going really long, kind of pushing the effort, breathing pretty heavy. And this is really where your sports nutrition comes into play. And the main point of a sports nutrition supplement is to provide fuel that you need that's efficient, easy to digest, convenient, portable, and also tastes good. And perhaps most importantly, it's easy on the gut so that it's not going to cause you any issues. And so that is our athlete sports nutrition pyramid. And I wanted to also go and ask each of our panelists if they had a newbie story about getting into sports nutrition or kind of an epic fail in the beginning that they wanted to share. So I'll start with you again, Sonia.
I'd like to say that I've only made this mistake as a newbie, but this has happened occasionally as an advanced rider. But one of the things that we forget about, especially on race day, is that we need water to digest the sugars that we're eating. So early on in my cycling career, I would be eating gels in my race. And a quick tip for people who want to eat gels in their race is GU has these gel flasks that you can get, and you can put like 4 or 5 gels in the flask. And I also add water and I shake it up, and it makes it a lot easier to take gel on race day. But whenever you're taking gels and you're also drinking Roctane, you also need to be having just plain water because that helps your gut digest the sugar. So I learned the hard way that you really do need the water. So I didn't drink the water. I was just doing all the sugar all day long, and I got really dehydrated because the water needs to come from somewhere in your body to help digest these sugars. And I bonked really badly, and I had to get an IV at the finish line. And that doesn't happen very often, but it's happened more than once. And sometimes it's just hard to remember to drink plain water.
Very good lesson learned. Yes, absolutely. And that's one of the key things we find with people who are just using gels for the first time is that they don't realize that you're supposed to actually take it with water as well. And that's to help with the absorption process. So very good tip and a hard way to learn that. Sorry about that. What about you, Greg?
So I guess mine takes me way back to when I switched from being a runner to being a cyclist, and having run competitively in college. I thought I was going to just take the cycling world by storm. But with running, it would always be 1 to 1.5 hours, and I never would run out of energy. But I guess what I didn't think about was going into cycling, I was actually going to start depleting my carbohydrate stores. And so I'll never forget the first ride I went on with the Collegiate Cycling Club in undergrad. And we got about 2 to 2.5 hours in, and I could barely, like, the road was moving in different ways. And I was like, so I guess, like, the newbie cycling tip is, like, don't hesitate to reach out and ask for help. And that, particularly as you progress into longer distances, you definitely have to be mindful of your nutrition and make good choices.
Yeah, make good choices. Good comment. And Jeff, what about you?
Man, it's been a while since I've had major bonks, years. So I go back to like early 2000s when I was first getting in the sport and playing around with gels, taking gels during races. And one of the things I found for myself, and this was before fat adaptation, so this would have been 18 or 20 years ago. I was taking gels, but I wasn't taking electrolytes. I wasn't thinking about my electrolyte balance. And so I was drinking, I had read that you're supposed to drink water with it. And so I was kind of working on, what Sonia was talking about. I had read that you're supposed to have liquid with it and needed more water to break down in the gut. And I was doing all those things, but I wasn't really thinking about sodium per liter, which I think about a lot, and I coach my athletes on now, is how much sodium per liter you're getting when you're exercising, especially for long endurance events like ultra marathons that we're doing, 50K to 100 miles or plus 200 milers. And so being a heavy sweater and a salty sweater, I was losing a lot of electrolytes and didn't realize that would affect my performance so much. And so that's where my tips are. And we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, later on in the discussion, but, get into more specifics. But, that electrolyte balance is also an important piece to be able to allow not only water, but also gels to, be absorbed through the gut wall into the bloodstream. So to be utilized instead of just sitting in the gut and causing a little GI stress.
Yeah, you make an excellent point about, it's not just about calories per se, but also about electrolytes that need to be replaced, which is another reason why we include, definitely amounts of sodium in our products, and definitely trying to take care of all of the micronutrient needs as well. So I wanted to start a little bit with a discussion on exercise physiology in a very basic sense, and metabolism, and how exercise changes your nutrition needs. And for that, I wanted to turn it over to the professor to share a few slides with us.
Thanks, Roxanne. I appreciate it. Look forward to being able to call you that soon too.
Thank you.
So I'm going to do a share screen real quick. Can you tell me if this works? All right. Can you see this?
Yep.
Awesome. So obviously I'm surrounded by such a incredibly impressive bunch of athletes. I want to start off by saying that I am no different from you. This is my general Sunday. Hopefully, though, you're watching your football team win. As you can tell, I usually watch mine lose. I also am daydreaming of the good stuff, carbohydrates, right? And even though I'm daydreaming and actually probably consuming all of these things, my energy expenditure is really fairly minimal. At rest, sitting around, most of us are burning about a calorie a minute, and that equivalates to about 1,500 calories a day if we were to just sit around at rest and watch our football teams all day. But that's my Sunday. My Saturdays look a bit different. Usually they consist of running, going for a run. That's why we're all here, right? And during these, energy expenditure looks substantially different, maybe burning up to 15 or 20 calories a minute. And I think that this contrast between my Saturday and my Sunday highlights something that is so miraculous about the human body, and that's its tremendous plasticity and its ability to adapt metabolically, to go from sitting on the couch and only burning 1 calorie a minute to going for a run and burning 15 or 20 or possibly even 25 calories per minute. And indeed, when we look at the scientific literature, we can provide evidence that, yeah, during high intensity or vigorous exercise, energy expenditure in the body can increase 20 to 25 fold. And it's pretty miraculous. And to be able to orchestrate this increase, our body relies on just so many physiological systems. And this is a really nice figure taken from a paper that was published in 2014. And I'm not going to go through the nitty gritty to provide you with all the details, because that would take an entire exercise physiology course. But suffice to say that we have all of these organ systems in the body. And really what happens when we go from sitting on the couch to going for a run or going for a bike ride or starting some exercise, the entire purpose of all of these different changes that happen in our body, our heart starts beating faster, we start breathing more deeply, we stop shuttling blood to our stomach and we start putting it towards our muscles, is to provide the muscles with the fuel they need. It's just like driving a car. When you push down the pedal, the car needs to go faster. It needs more fuel. And it's the exact same thing with the human body. And when we talk about fuel for the human body, it's really ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, that powers the human body and gets us to go. So how is it from the food we eat that we produce this fuel? And it can really come from three main things: the energy or the fuel that we make. It can come from proteins, it can come from carbohydrates, and it can come from fat. And to make things even simpler on someone who's not necessarily an expert in nutrition science, we'll just say that in a general healthy person, very little of the energy is coming from protein. If you're eating regular meals, less than 3% of the energy that you're creating, that ATP that you're creating, is coming from protein. So it's either coming from carbohydrates or it's coming from fat. And if we look at the amount of carbohydrates and fat that we have stored in the body, it's a stark contrast in the difference in amount. So the red dot, this is the stored carbohydrate we have in our body, and we store it in our muscles and our liver as glycogen. And in general, we'll store somewhere between 15 to 2,500. We'll just round to say 2,000 calories of carbohydrate can be stored. Meanwhile, this blue dot that doesn't even fit on this page, as you can see, I thought about trying to make the red dot smaller, but then no one would even believe it was there. This is the fat. We can store 60, 65,000, 70,000 calories worth of fat. And so you ask the question, well, why are carbohydrates important? Well, we store clearly so little of them compared to fat. And when we're producing energy, we're producing it from carbohydrates and from fat. And if we run out of those carbohydrates, they're absolutely essential for certain bodily functions, particularly for the brain. It's the primary and preferred fuel source for the brain. So if that depletes, we bonk and we feel bad and we slow down and our performance goes down. And so why do we supplement carbohydrates and take all this great goo energy when we're exercising? It's to preserve those very scarce carbohydrate stores. And we'll get into some more details, I'm sure. But I think that provides kind of a nice basic overview. So hopefully that makes sense.
Awesome. Yes, thank you for that. And that was a great depiction of our carbohydrate stores versus our fat stores, which I think it's really hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. And usually when I, try to explain, I'm like, yeah, you can only store maybe 1,500 to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates in your muscle and your liver, but you can store 50,000 to 100,000 calories in your fat stores of energy. It's like, that doesn't really register all the time. So thank you for the great visual depiction. That was awesome.
Thanks.
And so the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was, what are carbohydrates in general? So let me pull up one slide for you guys. And this is my very technical explanation, clearly. So what are carbohydrates? So as Greg explained, they are one of our major energy sources and very important specifically for the brain, because the brain really doesn't like to rely on much else besides glucose, which is a simple carbohydrate. Speaking of, there are, types of carbohydrates, so it could be simple or complex. And complex carbohydrates have deep thoughts, as you can see. That's a joke. But they do provide 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate that you eat. And so with that energy, you can, again, as Greg was saying, turn it into ATP, which fuels your exercise efforts. And simple carbohydrates include sugars like sucrose, which is table sugar, fructose, which is typically associated with fruits, and glucose, which is the body's preferred source and also what basically runs through your veins. You have about a teaspoon worth of glucose running through your system, fueling your energy at all times. And then there are complex carbohydrates, which include your starches and fibers and things that are a little bit more difficult to break down. They're not simple molecules. They're not single or double sugar molecules. They're longer strands of sugar particles linked together. And so those are your complex carbohydrates. And not all carbohydrates are made the same. And so again, as I was speaking about simple carbohydrates, you can see monosaccharides and disaccharides. That's just a fancy way of saying 1 or 2 sugar molecules linked together. So glucose, fructose are common ones that you'll see are monosaccharides. And then your table sugar is a disaccharide. And on the right side, you'll see more complex carbohydrates and things that are more difficult to break down. Again, starches, things that you'll find in things like potatoes or rice or bread. Those are, again, your complex carbohydrates. And so the next thing that I wanted to talk about was general nutrition for exercise. And how do you avoid what we call, and someone touched on earlier, the bonk, which is when you essentially run out of sufficient blood glucose that's running through your system and you become extremely fatigued and have to stop. And so as Greg was explaining, both carbs and fat fuel your activity, but it depends on the intensity, what you're relying on more of. So at lower intensities, moderate intensities, again, maybe hiking, an easy casual jog, you might be relying on more fat and a little less carbohydrate. But then as you start to pick up the intensity and you say go for a hard run or sprint, or you're cycling uphill, something very difficult, you're going to be almost entirely reliant on carbohydrate at that point. And again, that reiterates why it's so important to be able to supplement with carbs when you have very limited stores. And one question that I had for our audience is, or for our panelists, I'm sorry, is what do you eat before exercise? Because I know a lot of beginner athletes have this question is, what is going to sit well? What can I eat when I'm exercising or before I'm exercising that digests well and will provide fuel for my muscles? So let's start with Sonia.
So this is something that I've experimented with a bit because you're talking about simple and complex carbohydrates. And before exercise, you want to eat something that's going to be easily digestible. So usually simple carbohydrates are easier to digest. But for me, I tend to need something with a little bit more fiber to slow down the digestion, even on race day. So I think you need to figure out what works for you. But what I like to eat before a ride or before a race is typically a couple pieces of whole grain bread. And then I have almond butter and jam on it. And I keep it really simple. It's easy to digest. It's fast. On race mornings, if a race starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, I can eat that pretty quickly and I can eat it pretty close to the start instead of having to wait a long time for my food to digest. So that's my go-to.
Nice. Yeah, that's a pretty common one I hear from athletes. What about you, Greg?
Yeah, I think Sonia makes a great point that it's all about trial and error, unfortunately. But so I guess to that end, it's best to practice this stuff long before the race, right? Don't just find some diet and then just try it in the race day and hope it works. But for me, it's usually a bagel with a banana and maybe a little peanut butter on it. And then right before the race, honestly, I love the Goose Stroop waffles. I can digest them super easily and they're super tasty.
Yeah, that's definitely my go-to. I'll usually do a Stroop waffle with a little bit of nut butter on it and maybe some sliced banana. Jeff, what you got?
I'm totally the opposite. I eat 3 eggs, runny eggs with cooked in butter and half an avocado and some kind of coffee with heavy whipping cream. That's usually breakfast before long runs or before races. Sometimes I'll skip the avocado. And then occasionally I'll have fruit, a little bit of fruit, if I'm going to do an intense workout. So if it's a midweek workout where I'm going to do intensity, Most of my workouts are in the middle of the day. So, I'll have fat and protein in the mornings, and then about 2 hours or an hour and a half before that workout, I might have some berries or a banana or something like that if I'm going to do an intensity workout. So I'll strategically add in the fruit. So it just depends on what my goals are and what races are coming up, or whether it's a long effort or a harder effort, whether I'm doing speed work or whether I'm going out for a long, 4 or 5 hour run. So, but I'm mainly going for fat and protein, just because I don't want to mess with my insulin levels at all, because I want to really kick into fat burning, early. And then I start trickling simple carbohydrates like Roctane grape, at about an hour into the run.
And yes, for many of you who don't know Jeff very well, Jeff is considered a fat adapted athlete, and he's also an ultra endurance athlete. And so his intake is a little bit different from a lot of, what you'll see standard sports nutrition recommendations, and he does what works for him. And yeah, so we've had a lot of conversations over the past few years that I've known Jeff about strategic carbohydrates, and he obviously, as a GU athlete, does recognize that fueling with carbs goes a long way, and especially, in his fat adapted state, he's very strategic again about when he implements them. So part of the reason they have a time and a place.
Yes, they definitely have a place. I just use them a little more strategically and timed.
So yeah, I was excited to have Jeff on because he does have a unique perspective on carbohydrates, which we will definitely touch on a little bit later when we talk about different diets. Okay, well, thank you guys. That was awesome. I did have a question come through on the chat about what is Roctane drink. We were talking about it earlier, and I know a lot of us, most of us, use Roctane. And so Roctane is essentially our high performing, high calorie energy drink mix. And so this guy has 60 grams of carbohydrates, 250 calories per serving. So in this little pouch, which is essentially a water bottle full serving. And the purpose of this is to provide you with the maximal amount of carbohydrates that you would need for, say, an hour's worth of intense activity. It also has heightened electrolytes and amino acids. So the electrolytes, obviously, to replenish what you're losing when you're sweating. And then amino acids, which include the branched chain amino acids, will help protect your muscles from breakdown and help kickstart recovery later. So Roctane drink mix, we know it, love it, but it is definitely a high energy, high calorie drink mix for your very hard efforts and top intensities. Cool. So moving right along, let's talk a little bit about standard sports nutrition guidelines. People want to know, how much do I need, when, what to do, what if I've never taken a gel, etc. And so I do have a nice little rule of thumb chart that I like to share. And here we go. So this recommendations chart is kind of the standard sports nutrition recommendations right now as they stand. And this nice chart comes from My Sport Science, which is a resource I like to use a lot. But if you look down at the bottom, that axis is showing you how long you're exercising. And then these carbohydrate recommendations are based on the duration of your exercise activity. And so essentially for activities longer than about an hour, you can pretty much just get away with having some electrolyte drinks. You don't really need a ton of energy because you have enough stored within your muscle and liver glycogen, to provide what you need for exercise. And then as you start increasing the duration and you get into, say, 75 minutes or longer, that's when you want to start thinking about supplementing with carbs. And so you might go for 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and it depends on your tolerance level. And this is also something you can train. So by practicing your nutrition, you can get better at tolerating carbohydrates over time. And then finally, for those of you who are out there for a very long time, like Jeff and Greg and Sonia, then you might even get into 90 grams of carbohydrates or higher. There was a recent study that just came out. I don't know if you guys saw this, or you, Greg, about ultra marathon mountain runners in Spain, and they were taking in 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and not only found that it was tolerable, they could digest it and there was no real GI discomfort, but they also experienced less exercise-induced muscle damage after the race, which was pretty impressive. And they were exercising for about 4.5 hours. So they were out there a very long time. So again, these high intakes are something you need to train. You need to practice taking in that amount of carbohydrates, but it's also for something that's a very long duration. So really over 2.5 or 3 hours or more. And so for those of you who are just starting out and maybe you're doing an hour to 2 hours, trying to stick within that 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour range would probably be a safe bet.
Can I throw in a side comment here?
Of course, Jeff.
On intake. So if there's anyone listening out there that's more on like, using a ketogenic or low carb type of approach or carnivore type of approach to nutrition, the one thing they'll want to do is tinker around with a little less per hour, but still have that kind of IV drip idea of calories per hour after 1 hour. So that's one thing I would definitely say is a side note, because there are a certain amount of people out there doing that, and some people are doing it to manage metabolic issues that they might have, and still want to be an endurance athlete and train for these things. So that's another side note. Like most people are going to be able to handle a lot per hour and be able to train, like you're saying, but some people might want to try to tinker with that if they're working with a little bit of low carb approach, or a strategic carb approach like I do, which I wouldn't consider myself constantly keto. I use it more as a tool rather than a full-time diet. It's more like occasionally. So, that's a side note, because I take about 150 to 200 calories an hour. So I'm not taking very much, a half serving to a serving, 3/4 of a serving of Roctane per hour during exercise. So not very much, right? A half serving, what is that in how many grams of carbs
Of Roctane? That'd be 30 for a half serving.
Yeah. So I'm on the low end, right, of that. So just a side note.
No, you bring up a good point. And then, another thing to consider is, like you were saying, the IV drip approach, which is something I definitely advocate, as opposed to just trying to cram. If your goal is to get 200 or 300 calories in per hour, instead of taking 2 or 3 gels all at once, which each gel packet, our original GU Energy gels are 100 calories and about 20 grams of carbs, give or take, per gel. So instead of trying to take all 3 at once in the beginning of every hour, you want to spread them out. So I usually recommend trying to sip on something or be eating something every 20 minutes.
Well, and that's where Sonia's approach with the flask is a really great approach. And I have athletes who previously were having GI stress, and when we slowed it down to the IV drip idea, so instead of taking an entire gel at one time, multiple gels and mixing water in with the flask, and then you just take little sips. Instead of taking a whole gel every 20 to 30 minutes, you're popping, a little bit every, 10 minutes. You're taking a little hit off of your flask and constantly IV dripping those calories on an hourly basis. And I would stress again, according to your chart, after 1 hour or after 60 to 75 minutes.
Right. Yeah. So definitely, if you're not going to be exercising for that long, you don't necessarily need the calories, maybe just some hydration, electrolyte type beverage. But then if you are exercising longer than that, start to think about your carbs. I did have a question come through for you specifically, Jeff. Hopefully you can answer this. It says, are there certain carbs that you prefer that do not give you inflammation?
I tend to go for like a paleo, nutrivore, primal blueprint, whatever you want to call it. There's a whole bunch of terms out there floating around in our ancestral eating. There's all kinds of, but I kind of stick to that food list generally for lifestyle, diet, and groceries. And then I stick to simple carbohydrates, the kind of stuff that GU's making, nutrition because those are easy to carry. It's easy on the gut. It's easy to break down when you're exercising. But then in your lifestyle diet, sticking to more, I tend to stay away from a lot of grains. I do take a few grains here and there strategically. I'll occasionally have some rice, I'll occasionally have some quinoa. But I stick to more starch as my carbohydrate sources, like sweet potatoes, when I need more carbs after big efforts like long runs, or if I'm carb loading a little bit before a big effort. Fruit is my go-to, fruit and starch. So sweet potatoes, any kind of fruit, especially berries, bananas, apples, citrus fruit, stuff like that. I hope that answers the question.
Can I add something to that?
Please, yes.
Yeah, typically like white flour, white sugar, like really processed, refined carbohydrate like that is linked to inflammation. So if you're trying to reduce inflammation and you're worried about carbohydrates, trying to get away from that kind of stuff will help.
Yeah, real food.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that?
Come on in.
Okay, so I will say kind of another one of the mistakes I made when I was getting into the whole endurance sports is I did kind of get caught up in the difference between simple and complex carbohydrates. And so I was trying to eat a whole bunch of real complex carbohydrates with a lot of fiber. And I think I was actually doing myself a disservice, because if you actually look at trying to fully replenish carbohydrate stores after a workout, you're actually better off eating the high glycemic index foods that are going to spike your blood sugar and are going to spike insulin if you're trying to maximize glycogen resynthesis after a workout. So I think the type and the way you eat carbohydrates, you certainly need to account for what exactly are your goals. Obviously, Jeff is a unique athlete in that he's running for 100 miles, so 10 to 14 hours. And I think a lot of the people out there, while they may be interested in that, also might be more interested in running things like 5Ks to a marathon. And I think it's important to realize the difference between those and the intensity, the difference in intensity. The intensity Jeff is running for his 100 miles is just so low for him. And a lot of people are using carbohydrates. And so if you're trying to maximize glycogen resynthesis, then you shouldn't be necessarily fearful of eating more refined carbohydrates after a workout at the very least.
That's a great point. So thank you for bringing that up. I did also want to touch slightly on something we didn't really discuss in our mini exercise physiology review. So one of the big things that happens when you are exercising, and your chart did touch on this a little bit, is that, blood flow is going away from your gut, essentially going away from your stomach and your intestinal tract. And so at that point, when you're exercising and blood flow is going to your muscles and not towards your digestive organs, it becomes much more difficult to digest anything. And so, that's why it's so important to have things that are going to be easy to digest, and things that you have practiced eating. So yeah, that's a huge one. And then also being well hydrated goes a long, long way. So if nothing else, being able just to drink liquid calories, like we mentioned with the Roctane drink mix, can help a lot with avoiding GI issues, especially if you bring in, I know in California here, we're having this crazy heat wave right now. If you bring heat into the equation, that makes things even harder and more difficult to digest, and blood flow is even more directed to your skin to help cool you during the heat. And so in the heat, it's actually harder to digest things than even exercise under normal conditions. So for those of you who are out there exercising in the heat this summer, something to keep in mind is, making sure that you stay well hydrated and making sure that you have adequate nutrition on board.
Well,
I will say,
can I say one more thing about the post-workout food?
Go for it.
I would also put aside one thing that Greg was talking about was more like higher glycemic stuff. The only thing I would be careful of in that is that you want a lot of really high glycemic foods, like Sonia was talking about, more processed foods that cause inflammation. The problem is with some of those higher glycemic foods is they are highly processed foods, which they aren't very nutrient dense. And that's why I like real foods as a choice. Like your first go-to after you're done with a workout would be, say, fruit, because fruit has natural fructose. It's going to have a higher glycemic index than most in the real food category. So it's going to be super nutrient dense as well. So you're going to get some electrolytes from it. You're going to get some vitamins and minerals from it. And so real food as a first choice, I would kind of stress.
On that note, and everybody has their own post-exercise nutrition preferences, but I will say that we are going to have an episode coming up in a few weeks on specifically pre and post exercise nutrition. So that'll be a good topic for that. I did have a question come in that says, how long does it take your body to break down a food-based carbohydrate versus, say, a goo gel? And that's a great question coming from Sarah. So we have tested how long it takes gels to enter the bloodstream. So we have little glucose monitors that we can test. Somebody takes a gel and then we measure their blood glucose change over time. And so typically for our gels on an empty stomach, and this is going to change if you've eaten, but it takes about 15 minutes for that glucose from the gel to hit your bloodstream and, you know, be able to be utilized. And so for food, for actual whole foods, the process is going to take longer depending on the composition of that food. So things that are higher in protein, things that are higher in fat, things that are higher in fiber are going to digest much more slowly and hit your bloodstream much longer out than, say, a simple carbohydrate that's coming from a very easy to digest source. So, you know, I can't say specifically in minutes how long it would take a specific food to hit your bloodstream, but it is going to take longer because there is this mechanical digestion that has to occur. So your stomach has to break down the actual, you know, composition of that food with all of the chemicals, and then it has to go to the small intestine where it can be absorbed. So our gels take about 15 minutes on an empty stomach, give or take. And then, you know, some of our other products, which are, say, semi-solid, like a chew, or more solid, like a stroop waffle, will still be faster acting, but might take a little bit longer than 15 minutes to hit the bloodstream. Again, because there is that mechanical digestion that has to occur. So next question that I have for each of you. We each have a little bit of interest in certain diets, and I get a lot of questions from people about, you know, this diet or that diet. And I wanted to take a second to touch on, for instance, plant-based eating or vegan diets, which Sonia is very familiar with, fat adaptation, which Jeff is very familiar with, and then any other learnings that we have from the professor in his field. So let's kick it over to Sonia to start.
Yeah, so I changed my diet in 2013, and the initial reason wasn't for sports performance. It was because I saw a lot of research on preventing and reversing heart disease or cancer, or just longer term health implications of eating certain types of foods. So I decided to try eating a plant-based diet just to see what would happen. And I was actually really nervous that my performance would decrease because I thought, well, I'm not going to be eating meat anymore. I'm not going to be eating eggs. Like, don't I need that stuff? But I committed to eating whole foods, and we were talking about that earlier, the importance of eating real food. And I think that no matter what diet you're eating or what your lifestyle is, eating as much real food that comes in the wholest form as possible is going to keep you healthy. And I noticed for me, it was a surprise that my performance actually increased dramatically after I changed my diet. And eating a plant-based diet is very high in lots of fruits and vegetables, which are naturally anti-inflammatory foods. So that helps you with recovery. And it's also, plant-based diets have also been shown to reduce types of plaques and help with better blood flow in your body, which helps better blood flow to your muscles, better blood flow to your brain. So you're going to be getting better blood flow during your exercise and recovery. So those have been the main reasons for me as to why a plant-based diet has been good. And the biggest mistakes that people make when they do change their diet to plant-based is they tend not to eat enough calories, because a lot of the food isn't, like, depends on what you eat, but a lot of the food isn't super high in calories. So people eat until they're full and then they'll not get enough calories. So if you're trying to eat that way, you're feeling tired, try adding in more higher fat foods like almond butter, avocado, or just try eating more, because you need to actually eat more food.
All right. Yeah, thank you. And how long have you been vegan or plant-based?
7 years.
Awesome. That's amazing.
Thanks.
And Jeff, tell us a little bit about your strategy that you adhere to and kind of what got you started in the first place.
I was if you go way back, I was a vegetarian in my 20s, and then switched to was not really thriving on that, trying to run ultra marathons, and switched to a whole foods organic diet. So more, soaking legumes and rice and oats and, sprouted grains and that kind of thing. And, but went back to eating more, good sourced meat and stuff like that. And I did that for about 12 years and most of my ultra running career. And then in 2015, I switched to, I just basically cut out sugar and grains in my everyday diet, 90% of the time. And that really was a big performance enhancer because I saw a big anti-inflammatory response. So my recovery was better. And at that point I was in my mid 40s. So I'm 49. So, I am still racing hard. And so that becomes a very important piece when you're in your 40s. One thing you realize is, I was getting to the point where I was having such inflammation after big 100 milers that I looked at my wife in 2015 and was like, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And so I was kind of desperate, looking for a change. I had some GI issues in 2015 and was kind of doing a bunch of research and came across a bunch of forums on kind of paleo and primal blueprint type of eating and fat adaptation. And it was just kind of starting to get some talk in the endurance community after the FASTER study that Dr. Jeff Volek did at the University of Connecticut, and Zach Bitter and Ben Greenfield and all those guys who are kind of in that space were part of that test in the fat adaptation group. And I was really good friends with Zach at the time. And I called him up and started picking his brain and decided I would make the shift. And I was 7 weeks out from Hurt 100. And that's really, I had a great race, won the race in January of 2016, and really just saw a huge change. Not only like my body type even changed. I lost 8 pounds, 5% of my body weight, which obviously helps performance. I was able to take a lot less calories per hour. So I had less GI stress. I found that even when I ran out of food or ran out of water, even between aid stations, occasionally that happened in a couple of races after the adaptation, that I didn't bonk. So I didn't have, I'd have to slow down a little bit, but I didn't have that, for 15 years as a high carb athlete, I had lots of little bonks a lot, where you lose 20, 30 minutes during a 100 miler, you lose contact with the leaders in that kind of a bonk, right? It's like you lose the pack and you never get it back. And so if you can minimize that bonk, that 20-minute bonk or 30-minute bonk or 10-minute bonk where you lose contact, then you can stay in the mix the whole time. The other thing I found was just the recovery post-race was night and day to a high carb diet. And so I just was like, I was back quicker, after Hurt, I was doing air squats at like 72 hours after the race and was, texting photos to my wife of my ankles and my knees and looking like, oh my gosh, I can see my veins. What? Normally I had cankles post race. So it was a huge change as far as observationally and how I felt. And then when I play around with going back, every once in a while I'd fall off the wagon and go back and eat a bunch of pizza and eat a bunch of bread. And then I would get really inflamed. And I realized that that was causing inflammation, and I was getting an inflammatory response from that. And that was messing with my recovery. It was messing with my performance. And as you know, in endurance sports, it's all about consistency and be able to just continually put on a training load, recover, put on a training load, recover. And so if you can increase your recovery, you can do more training. And so that's the biggest benefits I saw. And that kind of was my path to where I am today. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's always great to share your story. And I know there are athletes who can definitely relate, and a lot of athletes who try as they might just have a hard time with, fueling during events. And so if going on, a high fat diet is something that can help them need to take in less so that they can absorb it better, then that's going to be great for them in the long run. So I appreciate you sharing your story and your perspective. And so I know there's people who can relate. I did have a question come through while you were talking. And since you are our resident triathlete expert here, Professor, it says, what is the best nutrition for a 3 hour plus race? And he is an Xterra athlete. Do you have any suggestions for our friend John?
Yeah, thanks for the question, John. So I tend to specialize in the half Ironman distance. So my races are taking around 4 to 4.5 hours. So hopefully I think we're kind of on the same page in that book. I tend to follow, my nutritional strategy has been more based off of my experience in academia and reading of the peer-reviewed literature. And so I would say the diet I follow would be one of high carbohydrate availability and maximizing carbohydrate availability. I would strongly encourage you to check out. There's a scientist by the name of Louise Burke, and she's undoubtedly probably the best in the world in this field. Just absolutely phenomenal sports performance nutritionist. And she feels very strongly that high carbohydrate availability is the way to go. Alex Hutchinson is a writer for Outside Online, and he just published an article discussing some of her most recent findings. And kind of like Jeff talked about, there's two different camps: the low carbohydrate, high fat, and then the high carbohydrate. And in 2017, Louise published a study that kind of was a bit challenging to the low carbohydrate, high fat. She took Olympic level race walkers and took them to a training camp, and she put some of them on a high carbohydrate diet and some on a low carbohydrate diet. And at the end of the camp, she showed a performance improvement in those who followed a high carbohydrate, and actually a performance decrement in those who were put on the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And when she looked at the mechanisms at play there, she showed what the scientific literature would have suggested would have happened back in the 1900s, that they became less efficient, that for every liter of oxygen that they were consuming or getting to their muscles, they weren't able to produce as much ATP. And if you look at the biochemical metabolism of carbohydrate and fat, that's indeed what that would portend to. And then the Jeff Volek camp challenged that again. And so they repeated the study and produced the exact same findings, that high carbohydrate was the way to go. Again, that the low carbohydrate, high fat had a performance decrement, and that was mediated by a reduction in metabolic efficiency. So my advice to you would be, leading into the race, try to focus on maximizing carbohydrate availability. 36 to 48 hours before, I would try to get in 8 to 10 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate. So per kilogram of body weight, that's a lot of carbohydrate if you think about it. I mean, I actually will keep a log the days before a race, because I get a little bit nervous going into a race, and sometimes I won't eat as much. And so I'll try to keep a log to make sure I'm getting enough. I mean, eating 3,000 calories of pure carbohydrate in a day it's no small task, believe it or not, particularly when you have the pre-race anxiety. So I would try to really maximize those carbohydrate stores leading in, because our carbohydrate storage, and particularly us as elite athletes, or even trained athletes, it's very plastic. So why I said most people can only store 2,000, if you really carbohydrate load, you might be able to store 2,500 or even up to 3,000 calories. And so that gives you a bigger bank going into the race by really carbohydrate loading going into the race. So there was something to those pasta dinners you had as a child. And then during the race, again, the chart Roxanne showed, I think is perfect. Trying to get in and experiment in training, 60, 70, or even 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And then one of the great things about GU is that they make their products with multiple transportable carbohydrates. And so by that, I mean, Roxanne showed that there's different types of carbohydrates, and the limiting factor when it comes to digesting carbohydrates is how quickly they can get from the circulation into the skeletal muscle. And so what GU has done is they've used that information to put both glucose and fructose, which enter the muscle through different transporters, into their products. And so in doing that, they're helping us to maximize the carbohydrate we can absorb and get into our muscle and use when we're trying to perform high intensity work. And so I think experimenting and training, and also the gut is adaptable. And so if in training we take in a little bit more carbohydrate each time, and we experiment with how much can we take in when we're training, when we get to the race, we have it down to a bit of a science.
And a very well-backed scientific response there from the professor, of course. Yeah, so again, for those of you who maybe aren't as practiced in your sports nutrition, trying to keep things super simple, if you were looking to do an event, maybe not like a 3.5 hour plus event, but just, maybe 5K, 10K, something like that, a good place to start. And what's on our packaging, even on every little goo packet, is, you can start with 5 minutes before, take an energy gel, and then about every 45 minutes of activity, if you're going that long, take another one. And that's a good place for most people to start to get familiar with, how to take the gel, how much water they need to drink with it so that it, it sits right in the stomach. And again, everybody's a little different. That's just a general starting off point and a rule of thumb for people who are just sort of getting into racing, or even if you're not racing or doing virtual races, people are just out there exercising and feel like they need to bring something.
Can I throw in some specifics?
Yeah, what's up, Jeff? Go ahead.
On just in general, for like, if that, also expound on like that question was how much and what you should be doing. Look at your nutritional plan as your race nutritional plan or long effort nutritional plan as an hourly protocol. So first hour, not much, sip on a little water to thirst, you're good, right? Because you're topped off, you've eaten before and you've eaten the day before, so your glycogen's topped off. But then as you start to get depleted at about an hour, you need to start having liquid with electrolytes of some sort. You need to be taking in, somewhere, depending on whether you're adapted on this end of the range or whether you're pushing those calories per hour, you're going to be somewhere in the 200 to 300 calories per hour range. And what we've seen, like most of the studies kind of back up that you can't really handle much more than 300 calories an hour. So I like to go by calories because, it's easy to look at, right? It's easy to look on the side of the package for most of the laymen and go, oh yeah, okay, this has this many calories in it, I'm good, like a gel or a powder or whatever, right? So 200 to 300 calories per hour, and then about a half a liter to up to 1.3 liters an hour. So depending on heat and sweat rate. So some people are going to be, on the side of the spectrum where they're not very heavy sweaters and they're not very salty sweaters, but some people like myself are really heavy sweaters, salty sweaters. We might be on the higher end of that range. And to put it in ounces, that's about 15 to 17 ounces to about 40 ounces an hour. And the longer you're out and the more you get depleted, the more that range might need to bump up a little bit. So you're going to be somewhere in that range. And then we also look the last column of information. And for all the athletes I coach, I make sure that they do a nutrition report card. So whenever I want them to know ballpark what they take an hour. And then also the last piece, besides calories per hour, liquid per hour, we look at sodium per liter. So sodium's a really important one because it helps utilize all your other electrolytes. It helps mineralize the water in your gut to get it into the bloodstream. So it's not just sitting there sloshing around. And so we look at like somewhere ballpark starting point is 600 to 800 milligrams per liter. So you look at all your sources, look at your food you're eating, the liquid you're drinking, the powdered drink you have, whatever your IV drip of calories. And the last piece is IV drip of calories, like we've been talking about. Never like overwhelming the gut at one time. Don't just put a bunch of, 300 calorie gut bomb into your gut at one time. If you have the chews, for example, I love those because you can take one and you can just chew on one, or Sonia's approach to where like you're putting it in a flask and you're taking sips off of it, or Roctane where you're just taking sips off your flask or your water bottle. So, thinking about those ranges, and that's your starting point, and there's going to be outliers. So some people might need a little more sodium per liter if they're really heavy sweater, and especially in really extreme hot conditions, like say something like Western States, Western States 100 for those ultra marathoners out there, super hot, it can be 100, it's been measured 108, 15, 118, in the canyons. So, on race day. So and at that point you're 12 hours into the race and you still got another 4 or 5 hours of running. So you really have to look at the conditions and adjust accordingly, but that's a starting point. So hopefully that helps too for those out there, those laymen. It gives you some numbers to start thinking about.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent roundup. And yeah, the last thing I would add to it is that we do make a range of products with a range of different electrolytes. Like for instance, our specifically salted lime chews have more sodium than our regular chews. So, these are regular watermelon chews. These are salted lime. These have 125 milligrams of sodium per serving. So we make products that, provide you with carbohydrates that are easy to digest, electrolytes that will help you stay hydrated, and amino acids to protect your muscles. I really want to thank you guys so much for joining me today. And a reminder to all of our viewers that if you go to jackrabbit.com, you can get 25% off your GU order by using the code FUEL25. That's FUEL 25 at jackrabbit.com. Please support your local sports nutrition retailer. And a big thank you again to all of our very knowledgeable guests. We could sit here for probably 2 or 3 hours and just keep talking, but everybody's got dinner to make and mouths to feed, so I will let you go. But thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week at 4 p.m. Thanks, guys.